Night falls over the eastern Mediterranean, and for a moment the sea looks calm. Along the harbours of Cyprus and Canaan, bronze ingots lie stacked beside jars of oil and wine. In Mycenaean palaces, scribes press symbols into wet clay while officials count grain shipments arriving from overseas. Farther south, in Egypt, temple walls glow beneath torchlight as priests recite rituals older than memory itself. The great kingdoms of the late Bronze Age appear immovable. Their rulers exchange gifts of gold, ivory, cedar, lapis lazuli, and royal daughters across hundreds of miles of water. Fleets cross the sea constantly. Messengers travel between capitals carrying seals and treaties. Everywhere there is wealth, hierarchy, bureaucracy, and confidence. And yet, beneath the surface of this interconnected world, something is already beginning to break. The sea carries rumours before it carries armies. Merchants speak of raids along distant coasts. Grain shipments arrive late. Some ships vanish entirely. In Anatolia, entire regions suffer failed harvests. Letters between kings become increasingly desperate. One ruler begs another for food. Another complains that enemy ships have appeared suddenly offshore. Garrisons disappear. Trade routes become uncertain. Cities that have stood for centuries start building new walls in panic. Then, in a span of years so short it barely seems possible, some of the greatest civilizations on Earth collapse almost simultaneously. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece burn. The Hittite Empire vanishes so completely that for centuries even its existence is forgotten. Coastal cities across the Levant are destroyed. Trade networks disintegrate, literacy declines, kingdoms that once controlled vast territories fragment into isolated survivors clinging to shrinking patches of stability. Entire populations move across the sea in search of food, land, or survival. And within the surviving records of this catastrophe, one shadowy name keeps appearing: the Sea Peoples. No ancient civilization ever leaves behind a neat explanation of who they were. There is no surviving homeland clearly identified beyond dispute, no unified empire, no single king. Almost everything known about them comes from frightened enemies or triumphant rulers claiming victory against disaster. Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples were invading armies, migrating populations, displaced mercenaries, climate refugees, pirates, or some unstable mixture of all these things at once. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that when they appeared, entire kingdoms trembled. The fear they inspired was not simply fear of attack. Ancient empires had faced enemies before. Egypt had fought Libyans, Nubians, Hittites, and countless rebellions. The Hittites battled rival powers for centuries. Warfare itself was nothing new. But the Sea Peoples arrived during a moment when the entire Bronze Age world depended on fragile connections that stretched across oceans and continents. Everything relied on movement: copper from Cyprus, tin from distant mines perhaps as far away as Central Asia, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, luxury goods from everywhere. The sea was not a frontier. It was the bloodstream of civilization itself. And suddenly that bloodstream became dangerous. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the world these empires built was astonishingly sophisticated, though much of it now survives only in fragments buried beneath ash and dust. Around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean is one of the most interconnected regions on Earth. Powerful states communicate through formal diplomacy conducted in Akkadian, the international language of the age. Royal courts exchange gifts with calculated precision. A king might send horses, silver cups, chariots, or exotic animals to another ruler hundreds of miles away. Marriage alliances bind kingdoms together. Merchant ships cross the sea, constantly carrying goods that fuel elite lifestyles and military power. Bronze itself is the foundation of this system. To make bronze requires copper and tin, and those resources rarely exist in the same place. That means trade is not optional, it is essential. Without steady maritime exchange, weapons cannot be produced at scale. Agricultural tools become scarce, armies weaken, palaces lose authority, entire economies begin to seize up. This dependence creates immense prosperity, but also immense vulnerability. A drought in one region can trigger shortages somewhere else. A disrupted shipping lane can destabilize kingdoms hundreds of miles away. If ports become unsafe, food stops moving. If food stops moving, cities starve. The late Bronze Age world is rich, but it is tightly wound, interconnected in ways its rulers may not fully understand themselves. And then the climate begins shifting. Pollen records, sediment cores, and isotope evidence suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean enter periods of severe drought around the same time these collapses begin. Harvests fail repeatedly in some regions. Famine spreads. Populations become restless. Scholars continue debating the precise timeline and severity of these climate events, but few now doubt that environmental stress plays some role in destabilizing the Bronze Age system. The sea changes too. Storm patterns may have become harsher. Coastal raiding increases. Maritime insecurity spreads through trade networks already under pressure. Some cities fortify their harbours, others hire foreign mercenaries. Among them are groups who may later become associated with the sea peoples themselves. One of the strangest details preserved in Egyptian records is that some sea raiders eventually serve inside Egyptian armies before later appearing as enemies. The Shurden, recognizable in Egyptian art by horned helmets and round shields, may have first fought against Egypt before entering royal service as mercenaries. This blurring of identities becomes one of the defining mysteries of the era. The ancient world does not always separate migrant, pirate, mercenary, refugee, an invader into neat categories. In times of collapse, people shift roles quickly. At first, the disruption seems survivable. Kingdoms absorb shocks, cities rebuild, trade continues, though less reliably. But beneath the appearance of continuity, the structure holding the entire system together is weakening. Palace economies depend heavily on centralized administration. Grain storage, taxation, labor management, military supply, and long-distance exchange all flow through bureaucratic centers. When enough pressure strikes simultaneously, the system becomes brittle. And brittle systems do not fail slowly. They fail all at once. Archaeologists excavating Bronze Age destruction layers often encounter a disturbing pattern. Burned palaces, arrowheads embedded in walls, sudden abandonment, storage jars left untouched, administrative tablets still waiting to be fired in kilns when flames consumed entire buildings. In some places, rebuilding never comes. The population simply disappears or scatters into smaller settlements. For centuries afterward, later civilizations look back on this age almost as a lost world. Greek traditions preserve faint memories of older kingdoms destroyed in war and fire. Egyptian inscriptions celebrate survival against enemies who arrived both by land and sea. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the archaeological record captures a civilization entering one of the most dramatic collapses in ancient history. and somewhere inside that collapse move the people later remembered as the Sea Peoples, not as one empire marching beneath a single banner, but as fragments of a world already coming apart. Their ships appear where trade once flowed safely. Their movements follow famine, instability, and weakening states. Sometimes they attack cities, sometimes they settle them, sometimes they vanish from the record entirely, only to reappear elsewhere under different names. Even now, more than 3,000 years later, no single explanation fully accounts for who they were or why they became so feared, but the fear itself is unmistakable. Because what ancient empires saw approaching across the water was not merely an enemy fleet, it was the possibility that their entire world was ending. The world that feared the Sea Peoples is not a primitive world trembling in the dark. It is a world of palaces, archives, ambassadors, accountants, shipwrights, bronze workers, treaty obligations, and international etiquette so elaborate that kings could insult each other with the weight of a gift. It is a world where a delayed shipment of copper can matter as much as a defeated army, where a marriage alliance can bind two distant courts, and where the fate of a city may depend on whether grain arrives before the next dry season. Across the eastern Mediterranean, power rests inside palace systems. These are not palaces in the modern sense of comfortable royal houses alone. They are administrative engines. In Mycenaean Greece, centres such as Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes gather agricultural produce, record labour obligations, distribute rations, store weapons, and direct craft production. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire rules from Hattusa over a vast and difficult landscape of mountains, vassal kingdoms, military roads, and treaty-bound dependencies. In Egypt, the pharaoh governs through a state older and more resilient than almost any other, drawing grain from the Nile Valley and projecting power into Nubia, Libya, Canaan, and beyond. Along the Levantine coast, cities such as Ugarit, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and Ashkelon serve as doorways between land and sea, receiving caravans from inland kingdoms and ships from across the water. These societies are different in language, religion, and political structure, but by the 13th century BC they belong to the same broad system. They know each other, they write to each other, they copy each other's prestige goods, borrow artistic motifs, employ foreign specialists, and sometimes use the same diplomatic language to conduct affairs between courts. In the archives of places such as Amarna and Ugarit, the ancient world appears not as isolated civilizations, but as a network of rulers who understand rank, reciprocity, and obligation. A king does not simply send gold because he is generous. He sends it because another king expects it, because prestige must circulate, because alliance has to be made visible in objects that shine. At the centre of this world is bronze. Bronze gives the age its name, but the metal is more than a technological marker. It is a dependency. Copper can be mined in major quantities on Cyprus, whose oxide ingots travel widely across the sea. Tin is far rarer, and its exact Bronze Age supply routes remain debated, with likely sources stretching across long and complicated networks. Without both metals, there is no true bronze industry. Without bronze, weapons, tools, armour fittings, ritual objects, and elite goods become harder to sustain. The great palaces do not merely desire long-distance exchange, they require it. This is one of the hidden weaknesses of the late Bronze Age. Its strength is connectivity, but that strength also binds distant crises together. A local shortage does not remain local for long. A war in Anatolia can affect trade in Syria, A failed harvest in Canaan can matter to Egypt. Trouble in Cyprus can threaten bronze supply across the whole region. A port burned in one season can leave inland elites without goods they need to maintain loyalty. The system is impressive because it is interconnected, and vulnerable for exactly the same reason. The sea is therefore both road and risk. To modern eyes, the Mediterranean can seem like a barrier between lands, but to Bronze Age elites it is often the easiest route between them. Ships move faster than carts over mountains. Coastal sailing links islands, harbours, and river mouths into a chain of exchange. Goods that would be slow and expensive to move overland can travel by water in heavy cargoes. This is how Cypriot copper reaches workshops, how Canaanite jars travel abroad, how luxury goods enter palaces, and how ideas spread silently with merchants and craftsmen. One lesser-known detail from this world is how standardized some forms of exchange become. The so-called oxhide ingots, named because their shape resembles a stretched hide with 4 protruding corners, are not random lumps of copper. They are shaped for handling, transport, and recognition. Divers have recovered such ingots from shipwrecks, including the famous Uluburun wreck off the coast of Anatolia, where a cargo from around the late 14th century BC carried copper, tin, glass ingots, ivory, ebony, resin, jewellery, weapons, tools, and objects linked to several regions. The wreck is like a drowned miniature of the Bronze Age world. It shows not a simple trade route, but a dense web of materials and identities moving together across the sea. For the palace elites, this exchange is not only economic, it is ideological. Kings prove their greatness by possessing rare things from far away. Ivory carved into delicate plaques, lapis lazuli from distant lands, amber from northern routes, horses, chariots, perfumed oils, fine textiles, and decorated vessels. The more distant the object, the greater its symbolic power. A ruler who commands foreign goods seems to command the world beyond his borders. But most people do not live inside that glittering circle. Beneath the palaces are farmers, herders, sailors, smiths, rowers, porters, soldiers, enslaved labourers, and dependent workers whose lives are tied to systems they do not control. They feel the palace through taxes, labour demands, military service, and ration lists. When harvests are good and ships arrive on time, the system can appear stable. When drought comes, when grain stores fail, when rulers demand more while offering less, loyalty becomes thinner. This is where the story begins to darken. The late Bronze Age economy is not a free market in the modern sense. Much production is organised through palatial authority. In Mycenaean archives, Linear B tablets list commodities, personnel, livestock, textiles, armour, chariot wheels, and offerings. These records are practical, not poetic, but their very dryness reveals a society managed with remarkable precision. A palace knows how many women are assigned to textile work, how many sheep belong to certain districts, how much bronze is distributed to smiths. It is administration at scale. Yet the records also show limits. They are local snapshots, often preserved only because fires baked them accidentally into permanence. They do not explain the feelings of hungry villagers or the decisions of desperate migrants. They do not tell the full story of tension between palace and countryside. What survives in the record suggests control, but control written on clay is not always the same as control in the fields. In Egypt, the Nile offers a different kind of resilience. The annual flood, when generous, produces agricultural abundance capable of supporting temples, armies, labour crews, and enormous state projects. Egypt is less dependent on imported grain than many neighbours, which may help explain why it survives the crisis when others do not. But even Egypt is not isolated. Its empire in Canaan depends on garrisons, tribute, diplomacy, and military prestige. Its armies include foreign mercenaries. Its temples desire imported timber, metals, oils, and luxury goods. Its rulers care deeply about the security of the Eastern Mediterranean because Egyptian power extends into that world. The Hittites face another set of pressures. Their empire is broad, militarized, and politically complicated, held together through treaties, vassal kings, and repeated campaigns. They have powerful enemies and restless dependencies. Their capital, Hattusa, stands inland, far from the sea. Yet the empire's survival still depends on access to Syrian ports, grain supplies, and stable routes. When the Hittite system collapses, it does not collapse because one wall falls. It unravels across a landscape of dependencies. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, may best represent the fragile brilliance of this age. It is wealthy, literate, cosmopolitan, and strategically placed between land and sea. Its scribes use several writing systems. Its merchants connect inland powers with maritime trade. Its kings correspond with Egypt, Hatti, Cyprus, and neighbouring states. It is a city made possible by the very networks that will later expose it to catastrophe. No single explanation fully accounts for what happens next. That is part of why the Sea Peoples remain so unsettling. They arrive not into a simple world of strong empires and weak outsiders, but into a system already loaded with stress, drought, famine, warfare, internal unrest, disrupted trade, technological shifts, and population movement all seem to play roles. Scholars still debate the weight of each factor. The Sea Peoples may be less the first cause of collapse than one of its most visible and terrifying expressions. The ancient empires fear them because the attackers come from the direction that once brought wealth. The ships that once carried copper, wine, grain, and gifts now may carry armed strangers, displaced families, and men with nothing left to lose. The harbours that once linked palaces into a shared world become openings through which disorder enters. For a palace society built on counting, storing, ranking, and controlling, few things are more frightening than people who cannot be easily counted, ranked, or controlled, and so the sea changes meaning. It is still blue under the sun. It still carries merchant vessels, fishermen, and messengers. But behind its brightness lies a new uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the horizon are groups whose names the scribes struggle to preserve, whose origins remain blurred, and whose movements seem to follow the breaking lines of the age. The world empires built is magnificent, but it has become too tightly connected to fail in only one place. When the first great shocks come, they travel along the same routes that once carried prosperity. The sea does not create the weakness by itself, it reveals it. The first problem with the Sea Peoples is that the name itself is not ancient in quite the way it sounds. No fleet appears in the Bronze Age record calling itself by that title. No confederation leaves behind a declaration of identity. No king of the Sea Peoples sends a letter to Egypt explaining his homeland, ancestry, or purpose. The phrase is a modern scholarly label, created to gather together several groups named in Egyptian inscriptions and associated with attacks, migrations, or military pressure around the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. It is useful, but it can also mislead. It makes them sound like a single nation rising from the waves, when the evidence points instead towards something more complicated and much harder to hold still. They are known mostly through the eyes of those who feared them, fought them, used them, or claimed to have defeated them. Egyptian texts preserve names such as Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Cheker, Denyen, Weshesh, and others. Some appear earlier than the Great Crisis. Some appear later. Some fight alongside Libyans. Some seem to arrive by sea. Some may move with families, carts, and possessions. Some become settlers. Others become soldiers in foreign service. The categories blur almost immediately. What survives in the record suggests not one people, but many groups caught in the violent movement of an age coming apart. This uncertainty matters because ancient states often describe outsiders in ways shaped by politics, fear, and royal display. Egyptian kings do not carve temple reliefs to offer neutral ethnography. They carve them to announce order restored, enemies crushed, the pharaoh victorious beneath the gaze of the gods. The defeated foreigners are shown with distinctive helmets, kilts, shields, hairstyles, ships, and weapons. But these images are not photographs. They are symbols arranged for power. They contain real information, but they also serve royal ideology. Scholars still debate how much can be safely extracted from them. Yet even through the propaganda, something unusual comes through. The sea peoples appear as mobile, dangerous, and difficult to place. They do not fit the older pattern of a rival empire with a capital, bureaucracy, and diplomatic address. Egypt can negotiate with Hatti because Hatti has a king. It can send letters to Babylon because Babylon has a court. It can fight Libya because Libya, though not a centralized state in the same way, has identifiable chiefs and regions. But the sea peoples appear in shifting combinations. They are named as groups, not as a single kingdom. They are associated with ships and movement. They seem to emerge from beyond the ordered map of palace diplomacy. To a Bronze Age ruler, this is deeply unsettling. A known enemy can be terrifying, but at least he belongs somewhere. He can be threatened, bribed, married into, defeated, or made into a vassal. His lands can be mapped. His envoys can be received. His tribute can be demanded. The sea peoples resist that logic. They are not completely unknowable, but they are not easily managed within the habits of imperial power. Their origins have been argued over for generations. Some scholars connect certain groups with the Aegean world, including regions affected by the collapse of Mycenaean palace society. Others see links to Western Anatolia, Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, or the central Mediterranean. The Shurden, for example, have often been associated by name with Sardinia, though the connection remains debated and cannot be treated as settled fact. The Shekelesh have been linked by some to Sicily. The Denyen have been compared with names known from Anatolia or later Greek tradition. The Peliset are widely associated with the later Philistines of the southern Levant, though exactly where they came from before settling there remains a subject of ongoing research. These possible links are intriguing, but names alone are dangerous evidence. Ancient names shift, survive, echo, and deceive. Archaeology offers clues, but not simple answers. In the southern Levant, early Iron Age Philistine sites reveal material culture with Aegean-style features, including pottery traditions, cooking practices, architectural elements, and some dietary habits that differ from nearby Canaanite patterns. This does not mean a whole Greek population simply invaded and replaced everyone. Culture moves through migrants, trade, imitation, intermarriage, elite identity, and local adaptation. The evidence suggests some kind of foreign or mixed incoming element, but the scale and nature of migration remain debated. The picture is not one of a clean ethnic bloc landing on shore. It is a messy process of arrival, settlement, transformation, and blending. That messiness may be the key. The Sea Peoples may not have begun as Sea Peoples at all. They may have been many communities pushed into motion by crisis. Some may have been professional warriors whose old employers could no longer pay them. Some may have been coastal raiders taking advantage of weakened states. Some may have been refugees fleeing famine, warfare, or collapsing palaces. Some may have been displaced elites trying to carve out new territories. Some may have been ordinary families travelling with armed protectors because the road and sea had become unsafe. No single explanation fully accounts for this range of evidence. One surprising detail from Egyptian scenes of Rameses III is the presence of ox carts and non-combatants in depictions of enemies associated with the crisis. This is not merely an image of raiding warriors leaping from ships. It suggests, at least in Egyptian presentation, a movement of people carrying households, belongings, and dependents. Whether the relief compresses several events into one royal drama is debated, but the detail is important. It points toward migration as well as war. Empires may have feared not only soldiers, but populations on the move. That fear is ancient and familiar. A raiding party can burn a town, seize goods, and leave. A migrating population asks a much larger question: who controls the land now? When armed groups arrive with families, the crisis shifts from military defense to political transformation. The issue is no longer only whether a city can repel an attack. It is whether the entire map of settlement is being rewritten. Still, the Sea Peoples should not be imagined as helpless victims of circumstance alone. The evidence also shows violence. Cities are destroyed. Egyptian inscriptions describe battles. Some groups fight fiercely enough to enter the memory of great kings. Maritime raiding requires skill, organization, ships, knowledge of coastlines, and leadership. These were not random crowds drifting helplessly across the water. They included experienced fighters and sailors capable of exploiting weakness in some of the most powerful states of the age. Their ships are part of the mystery. Egyptian reliefs show vessels with bird-head decorations at prow and stern, high curved ends, and rowers arranged for movement along the coast. These images are stylized, but they suggest maritime traditions different from Egyptian riverine craft. The seagoing capacity of these groups matters because land empires are most comfortable defending roads, borders, forts, and known approaches. Ships change the geometry of danger. An enemy can appear suddenly near a harbour, bypass fortified inland routes, strike supply points, and vanish before a central authority responds. For palace states, that is a nightmare. The Sea Peoples become frightening not because they are supernatural or uniquely destructive, but because they embody a kind of warfare and movement that palace systems are poorly designed to absorb during a wider crisis. They come through the same maritime corridors that hold the economy together. They appear in multiple regions. They may include people who already know the military systems they are attacking, because some have served as mercenaries inside them. They may understand where wealth is stored, where defences are weak, and how dependent great kingdoms are on predictable exchange. This is where the story stops being a simple invasion tale. The Sea Peoples are not best understood as a mysterious horde arriving from nowhere to destroy civilization in a single blow. They are part of a collapsing world, and perhaps also products of it. Their identities may have formed during movement, conflict, and displacement. Groups that were once separate could have joined together. Mercenary bands could have absorbed refugees. Raiders could have become settlers. Defeated migrants could have entered foreign armies. Over time, names recorded by Egyptians may represent coalitions rather than fixed ethnic nations. The ancient records preserve them as enemies, but archaeology forces a broader view. Behind every name may stand not just warriors, but broken trade routes, burned palaces, failed harvests, ship crews without patrons, families searching for land, and communities trying to survive after older political structures collapse. This does not make them peaceful, it makes them historical. And that may be the real reason they remain so difficult to define. They belong to a time when the boundaries between invader and refugee, pirate and soldier, foreigner and neighbour, are breaking down. The sea does not simply deliver them to history, it reshapes them while they move. Somewhere beyond the horizon, before Egyptian scribes write their names and before temple walls turn them into defeated figures beneath the pharaoh's chariot, they are already changing. They are people from fractured places, carrying weapons, memories, skills, hunger, and perhaps myths of homes they can no longer keep. By the time they appear in the records of frightened empires, they are no longer only who they were. They are what the crisis has made them. The first signs of rupture do not look like the end of the world. They look like inconvenience, delay, shortage, anxiety. A shipment does not arrive when expected. A frontier official complains that supplies are thin. A ruler sends a request for grain with a tone that is too urgent to be merely diplomatic. A city strengthens its walls, perhaps not because destruction is certain, but because danger has become imaginable. In the years before the Great Collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean does not simply fall silent, it becomes nervous. This is often how large systems fail, not with one clean moment, but with accumulating stress that powerful people explain away until explanation no longer works. The late Bronze Age kingdoms are used to crisis. They know war, famine, rebellion, and political rivalry. Their scribes record problems because administration exists to solve problems. But around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, the problems begin to overlap. Drought strains harvests, warfare disrupts roads, maritime raiding threatens ports, palace economies grow more brittle, people move, rulers ask for help, and somewhere in that widening instability, the groups later called the Sea Peoples begin to matter more. Climate evidence suggests that parts of the Eastern Mediterranean experience prolonged dry conditions around this period. The exact timing and regional severity remain debated, because ancient climate is reconstructed through indirect traces pollen, lake sediments, cave deposits, tree rings, and chemical signatures. These records do not speak with one simple voice. Still, the larger pattern is difficult to ignore. Several regions appear to suffer environmental stress at the same time that political systems begin failing. Drought alone does not burn palaces or sink ships, but it can make every other danger sharper. A failed harvest does more than empty stomachs. It weakens trust. Farmers cannot meet obligations. Palaces cannot distribute rations as expected. Local elites may hoard grain. Soldiers may go unpaid or underfed. Dependent workers may flee. Families may sell possessions, abandon land, or join movements of people searching for survival elsewhere. When food becomes uncertain, authority is tested at the most basic level. A king may claim divine favour, but if grain jars are empty, the claim grows thin. The records preserve flashes of this pressure. In the Eastern Mediterranean, letters speak of famine and urgent requests for food. Hittite rulers appear to seek grain from Egypt at moments of need. Ugarit's archives show a world where military demands and maritime threats are becoming impossible to separate. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that rulers are not watching a distant problem. They are living inside a tightening crisis. What adds another layer? The Late Bronze Age is already militarized. Chariots, fortified cities, tribute networks, and vassal obligations shape international politics. The Great Battle of Kadesh between Egypt and the Hittites, fought decades before the final collapse, shows the scale of imperial warfare in this world. Thousands of troops, chariots, and allied contingents could be drawn into campaigns. Such power looks impressive on temple walls, but maintaining it is expensive. Armies consume food, metal, animals, labour, and administrative attention. In a stress system, military strength can become another burden. Internal unrest is harder to see, but it must not be ignored. Palace records tend to show society from the viewpoint of administrators, not from the viewpoint of those being administered. When a palace burns, it is tempting to imagine only foreign enemies at the gate. Yet some destructions may involve local rebellion, civil conflict, opportunistic looting, or elite struggles. Archaeology often cannot identify the attackers. A fire layer proves burning, not motive. An abandoned site proves departure, not always invasion. Scholars still debate how many destructions should be attributed directly to outside groups, and how many reflect internal collapse. This uncertainty is essential. The Sea Peoples did not move through a perfectly stable world and single-handedly knock it down like a row of pillars. They moved through a world already cracking. In some places, they may have been attackers. In others, they may have been symptoms of the same disorders that were weakening their targets. In still others, they may have taken advantage of destruction caused by different forces entirely. Piracy, too, becomes more than a nuisance. In a world dependent on sea traffic, piracy is not a side issue, it is a structural threat. A few ships lost to raiders may mean a shortage of copper, tin, grain, or luxury goods. Insurance does not exist. Communication is slow. A coastal town cannot simply radio for help. If sailors begin avoiding certain routes, the economic effect spreads quietly but seriously. The palace does not need every ship to sink. It only needs uncertainty to become regular. One lesser-known detail from the Bronze Age world is that many so-called pirates may not have been outsiders in the simple sense. Some were likely men with maritime knowledge, military experience, and connections to the very networks they attacked. A sailor who once carried cargo can become a raider if trade collapses. A mercenary who once defended a harbour can plunder it if his employer falls. A displaced noble can lead armed followers into piracy while claiming a more respectable purpose. The line between commerce and violence at sea has often been thin in history, and during collapse it becomes thinner still. This helps explain why ancient rulers feared these movements so deeply. The threat is not only that strangers arrive, it is that known systems become unreliable. The sea captain may be trader one year and raider the next. The mercenary may be protector in one campaign and enemy in another. Coastal peoples may be allies until hunger or politics changes the calculation. Empires depend on categories, but crisis melts categories. The first ruptures also appear in the geography of settlement. Some regions show destruction at major centres, followed by shifts towards smaller, more defensible, or more rural communities. In parts of Greece, the palace system disappears, and writing associated with palace administration vanishes for centuries. In Anatolia, Hattusa is abandoned and the imperial Hittite system breaks apart, though successor states preserve elements of Hittite culture elsewhere. In the Levant, Some cities are destroyed while others survive or transform. The pattern is uneven, and that unevenness matters. Collapse is not a wave that flattens everything equally. It is a storm that breaks hardest where structures are already exposed. The turning point is not one battle. It is the moment when disruption becomes self-reinforcing. Drought encourages movement. Movement increases conflict. Conflict interrupts trade. Interrupted trade weakens palaces. Weakened palaces cannot protect roots or feed dependents. More people move. More groups arm themselves. More cities fear the horizon. In such a cycle, the sea peoples are not merely invaders from outside the system, they are also part of the system's unravelling. For the rulers of the Late Bronze Age, this is almost impossible to admit. Royal ideology depends on order. The king defeats chaos. The gods favour the throne. The palace counts the harvest, commands workers, stores weapons, receives tribute, and speaks to other kings as an equal among the great. To acknowledge that the entire structure is vulnerable to drought, hunger, raiding, migration, and economic breakdown would be to acknowledge that power is less absolute than it appears. So the records simplify. Enemies are named, victories are carved, disorder is given faces, helmets, shields, and ships. This does not mean the enemies are invented. They are real. People fight, die, flee, and settle. But the official record turns a complex collapse into a drama of royal defence. The pharaoh stands firm. Foreigners fall. Order survives. Outside the carved scene, the truth is more troubling. No empire fears only the spear. It fears the failure of prediction. It fears not knowing where the next blow will land. It fears allies becoming unreliable, roads becoming unsafe, harvests becoming uncertain, and seas becoming hostile. The sea peoples become terrifying because they appear at the precise moment when confidence itself is failing. In the old rhythm of the Bronze Age, ships meant connection, they meant trade, tribute, diplomacy, and wealth. Now, the same horizon carries a different meaning. A lookout on a city wall sees sails in the distance and cannot know whether they bring cargo, refugees, mercenaries, raiders, or all of them together. That uncertainty is the first true sign of collapse. The world has not ended yet, but it has begun to doubt its own survival. At Ugarit, the end arrives with clay still wet enough to become immortal. The city stands on the Syrian coast, close to the sea but connected to the inland world by roads, treaties, tribute, and caravans. It is not the largest power of the Late Bronze Age, nor the most famous in later memory, but in the final years before the collapse it becomes one of the most haunting places in ancient history. Ugarit is a port city, a royal city, a merchant city, and a scribal city. Its archives preserve diplomatic letters, legal documents, myths, inventories, treaties, and urgent messages written in the shadow of disaster. Because fire bakes clay tablets hard, destruction saves what ordinary time would have erased. The flames that kill the palace also preserve its last fears. Ugarit's position is both its wealth and its danger. It sits where the maritime world and the inland empires meet. Ships from Cyprus and the Aegean can reach its harbours. Caravans from Syria and Mesopotamia can move through its networks. The Hittite Empire draws it into political obligation. Egypt matters to its horizon. Cyprus, known in texts as Al-Ashiyah, lies across the water as both partner and warning. A city like Ugarit prospers because the world is connected. When that connected world becomes unstable, Ugarit becomes exposed. The archives show a society deeply involved in the machinery of the Bronze Age. Scribes at Ugarit write in multiple languages and scripts, including Akkadian cuneiform for international correspondence and a local alphabetic cuneiform used for Ugaritic. This is one of the remarkable details of the site. Ugarit is not merely receiving civilization from elsewhere, it is creatively adapting writing itself. Its alphabetic system is an important step in the long story of written language. Though it will not survive as a dominant script after the city's destruction, in a terrible irony, one of the places most alive with writing becomes one of the places where a written world suddenly stops. The tablets do not provide a clean narrative, but they preserve flashes of panic. Letters refer to enemy ships. They speak of danger along the coast. They reveal rulers asking for information, troops, and assistance. One famous exchange from nearby Al-Ashir warns of enemy vessels and urges vigilance. Another Ugaritic message suggests the city's own forces may be absent, sent elsewhere under Hittite command when they're most needed at home. Scholars still debate the exact sequence and context of these tablets, because many were found in destruction debris and not always in perfect archival order. But the emotional force of the evidence is hard to miss. Ugarit is not destroyed in ignorance. It sees danger coming, or at least sees enough of it to be afraid. That detail gives the catastrophe its human weight. Collapse is often imagined from far above, as arrows on a map or layers in an excavation trench. Ugarit brings it down to the scale of offices, storerooms, courtyards, and scribal hands. Someone receives news that ships have appeared. Someone sends a message. Someone waits for a response. Someone counts available troops and realizes they are not enough. Someone looks toward the harbour and understands that the sea, which made the city wealthy, may now bring its ruin. The evidence remains incomplete, and no responsible account can say exactly what every person in Ugarit experienced. But the destruction layer is real. The city is violently destroyed around the beginning of the 12th century BC and never recovers its Bronze Age role. The palace burns, houses burn, archives are buried. The urban life that had made Ugarit a jewel of the coast comes to an abrupt end. It is tempting to say the sea peoples destroyed Ugarit, and they may indeed have played a role. The timing, coastal setting, and references to enemy ships make the association plausible. But archaeology rarely gives such simple verdicts. The attackers are not caught in the act with name tags carved into their shields. The city's fall may involve maritime raiders, wider regional warfare, the weakening of Hittite protection, local instability, or several forces at once. No single explanation fully accounts for all of it. What can be said is that Ugarit falls during the same storm of disruption in which the sea peoples become visible, and its last messages show exactly why coastal kingdoms fear what is happening. One of the most striking things about Ugarit is the gap between administrative normality and approaching doom. Many tablets concern ordinary life property, trade, ritual, debts, personnel, supplies. This is how societies experience catastrophe before it becomes obvious. People continue keeping accounts, officials continue writing letters, merchants continue expecting cargo, priests continue performing rites, families continue living inside the rhythms they know. Then a crisis that had been discussed in messages and rumours becomes fire in the streets. The city's destruction is not only a local tragedy, it is a signal that the system itself can no longer protect its nodes. Ugarit is not an isolated fishing village. It is tied to Hatti, Cyprus, inland Syria, and the maritime trade network. If such a city can fall and stay fallen, then the old guarantees are failing. Treaties no longer secure the coast. Imperial overlords can no longer reliably defend vassals. Wealth can no longer purchase safety. Letters can no longer move quickly enough to outrun ships. This is one of the reasons Ugarit matters so deeply in the story of ancient fear. It shows that collapse is not merely destruction from outside. It is also abandonment by the systems that once promised protection. A city can be loyal and still be left exposed. It can be rich and still be vulnerable. It can be literate, connected, and diplomatically sophisticated, yet still unable to survive when the forces around it move faster than its institutions. The people of Ugarit likely know the sea intimately. Sailors read winds, currents, and seasonal patterns. Merchants understand risk. Harbour workers recognize hull shapes and cargo types. Foreign accents are probably normal in the streets. This is not a city afraid of strangers by nature. Its wealth depends on strangers. But there is a difference between ordinary foreignness and the arrival of armed groups during a general crisis. The port that once welcomes many peoples now has to decide which ship is trade and which is danger. The tragedy is sharpened by the fact that Ugarit's world is one of messages. It knows how to communicate across distance. Its scribes can send intelligence, warnings, requests, and diplomatic appeals, yet communication does not equal rescue. A warning tablet can cross the sea and still arrive too late. A king can ask for troops that never come. A ruler can know the name of a threat and still be unable to stop it. Knowledge survives where the city does not. The last tablets from Ugarit have often been read almost like voices from a doomed world, though caution is needed. They are administrative and diplomatic documents, not personal diaries. They do not tell a neat final scene. Still, their survival creates an extraordinary intimacy. The collapse is not only known through later memory or victorious inscriptions. It is preserved in the paperwork of people who are still trying to manage events as they unfolded. That is a rare and unsettling gift. In Egypt, the sea peoples will be turned into carved enemies beneath royal power. At Ugarit, the crisis feels less controlled. There is no grand victory scene. No surviving local monument announces that order has been restored. Instead, there is interruption. A city that should have continued does not. The scribal system stops. The palace economy stops. The port loses its place in the old network. The silence after Ugarit is as important as the fire. And beyond that silence lies a wider lesson. The real terror of the sea peoples is not only that they could burn a city. Many armies could do that. The deeper terror is that they appear when a city like Ugarit can no longer rely on the world that made it possible. A port city exists by trusting movement. It trusts that ships will bring wealth more often than violence, that allies will answer, that trade will continue, that distant powers will remain distant but dependable. When that trust breaks, the sea becomes a question no wall can fully answer. Ugarit's tablets survive because disaster hardens them. The city's fear survives for the same reason. Egypt does not meet the storm as a helpless kingdom waiting to be erased. By the time the sea peoples appear in its royal record, Egypt is ancient even to itself. Its temples are already filled with memories of earlier dynasties. Its kings rule beneath titles that present them as guardians of cosmic order. Its scribes know how to turn danger into narrative, battle into theology, and survival into proof that the gods still favour the throne. If other kingdoms vanish into ashen silence, Egypt does something different. It survives, and then it carves survival into stone. That survival is one of the reasons the sea peoples are remembered at all. The Egyptian evidence comes mainly from royal inscriptions and reliefs, especially under Merneptah in the late 13th century BC and Rameses III in the early 12th century BC. These records are invaluable, but they are not neutral reports. They are monuments of victory. They exaggerate, compress, glorify, and arrange events around the pharaoh. Yet without them, the sea peoples would be far more obscure. Egypt gives them names, images, and a place in history, even while presenting them as enemies crushed beneath royal power. The first major Egyptian encounter associated with these groups comes under Merneptah, son of Rameses II. His reign faces a dangerous coalition connected with Libya and several named foreign groups, including some later counted among the Sea Peoples. This is not yet the famous Great Invasion scene of Rameses III, but it matters because it shows that the phenomenon does not begin suddenly in one year. Groups such as the Shurden, Shekelesh, and others are already moving within the military landscape of Egypt's western and northern frontiers. Some arrive as enemies, some may already be known as mercenaries. The pattern is complex from the beginning. Egypt's western border with Libya has long been a zone of conflict, migration, and exchange. Libyan groups press toward the Nile Delta, sometimes in search of land, pasture, or advantage. When foreign sea-associated warriors appear alongside Libyan forces, Egypt sees not a single isolated raid but a coalition crossing categories that imperial defense prefers to keep separate. Desert frontier pressure and maritime movement begin to overlap. The pharaoh's task is to show that all of it has been contained. Merneptah's inscriptions describe victory in the language of overwhelming royal certainty. Enemies are defeated, bodies are counted, threats are transformed into numbers, and numbers into proof. This habit of counting severed hands, captives, weapons, or casualties may seem grimly bureaucratic, but it fits the Egyptian worldview of restored order. Chaos must not merely be defeated, it must be measured. To count the enemy is to reduce terrifying movement into controlled record. But the crisis does not end with Merneptah. A generation later, under Rameses III, the danger returns in a form that Egyptian monuments present as existential. At Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, great reliefs show battles against enemies arriving by land and sea. The scenes are among the most famous images of the late Bronze Age collapse. Ships crowd the water. Egyptian archers fire from the shore and from vessels. Enemy ships are overturned. Foreign warriors with distinctive helmets and round shields struggle amid the chaos. Elsewhere, families and ox carts appear, suggesting not only a raid but a movement of people. These scenes are dramatic because they show Egypt doing what many other states could not, stopping the storm at the edge of its own heartland. Rameses III presents the attackers as a coalition that has already devastated other lands before turning toward Egypt. The inscriptions claim that no land could stand before them, that great powers were uprooted, and that the enemy came with confidence toward the Nile. The language is royal and ideological, but it preserves something important. Egypt understands the threat not as ordinary border warfare, but as part of a wider regional catastrophe. The pharaoh is not merely defending a province, he is standing at the last gate of order. Scholars still debate how literally to read these accounts. Egyptian kings often use grand formulas to describe enemies. They had every reason to magnify the scale of danger in order to magnify the scale of victory. The reliefs may combine events, stylize ships, and arrange scenes for symbolic effect. Yet archaeology and wider regional evidence confirm that Rameses III's reign falls during a period of real upheaval. The fear behind the monument is not invented from nothing. One surprising detail is that Egypt may have prepared carefully for the sea battle, rather than simply meeting it by chance. The Medinet Habu reliefs suggest a coordinated defence in which enemy ships are drawn into constrained waters and struck by archers from land and Egyptian vessels. If this reflects real tactics, Egypt understands that the strength of maritime attackers lies in mobility and works to deny them open movement. The sea raiders are dangerous on the open coast. In channels controlled by Egyptian forces, their ships can become traps. This matters because Egypt's survival is not only due to divine kingship or monumental confidence, it has geographical advantages. The Nile Valley is narrow, rich, and administratively deep. The delta can be defended through waterways, forts, fleets, and local knowledge. Egypt has grain reserves and a long tradition of state organization. It is not immune to crisis, but it has resources that some palace states lack. When attackers approach, Egypt can concentrate power more effectively than fragmented coastal kingdoms. Even so, survival comes at a cost. Egypt does not emerge from the crisis unchanged. The new kingdom weakens over time, its influence in Canaan declines, economic strain grows, internal problems intensify. Later Ramesside kings inherit a state still impressive but less able to dominate the wider region as before. Victory over the Sea Peoples does not restore the old Bronze Age world. It only prevents Egypt from being destroyed with it. That distinction is crucial. Rameses III can carve enemies beneath his feet, but he cannot bring back Ugarit. He cannot restore the Hittite Empire. He cannot rebuild the Mycenaean palace system. He cannot make long-distance bronze networks function as they had before. Egypt survives the storm, but the sea beyond its borders no longer belongs to the same world. The victory is real, yet it is also lonely. The Sea Peoples in Egyptian art become almost too visible. Their horned helmets, feathered headdresses, round shields, and ships create the illusion that they are fully known. But images can deceive by giving mystery a face. A figure carved on a temple wall looks definite, complete, almost ethnographic. In reality, each helmet and shield stands inside a political composition. The artists are showing types of enemies arranged for Egyptian meaning. They preserve valuable clues, but not full biographies. Among these groups, the Peliset become especially important because they are later linked with the Philistines of the southern Levant. The Egyptian record suggests that after defeat, some groups may have been settled in regions under Egyptian influence. This may reflect a familiar imperial practice. Defeated peoples can become controlled populations, soldiers, or buffer communities. But the details remain debated. The evidence does not allow a simple picture in which Egypt captures an entire people and neatly places them on a map. What survives suggests a more complicated process of conflict, settlement, and gradual cultural formation. The fear Egypt records is also theatrical. Royal ideology requires enemies to be formidable. A small threat does not make a great king, but the scale of the wider collapse gives the drama weight. Rameses III is not only boasting when he presents the attackers as terrifying. He is speaking to a world in which terror is credible. News of destroyed cities, moving peoples, and broken kingdoms would have made such claims believable. Egyptians hearing or seeing these records may have understood that the danger was not abstract. For common people in the Delta, the fear must have been immediate. Ships offshore are not diplomatic metaphors. They are wood, sail, oars, armed men, and uncertainty. Villages near waterways may have watched soldiers gather, Grain stores may have been guarded. Families may have heard that foreigners were approaching with carts and warriors. The temple wall gives the pharaoh's view, but beneath it lies a human landscape of preparation, rumour, and relief. Egypt's encounter with the Sea Peoples therefore reveals both power and vulnerability. It shows a state capable of organising defence under immense pressure. It also shows that even the strongest kingdoms cannot ignore the movement of people across the sea. The pharaoh may claim to have trapped the invaders like birds in a net, but the need for that claim reveals how far the crisis has reached. Egypt, protected by desert, river, and ancient administration, still has to fight at the water's edge. And after the battle, the old certainty does not fully return. The inscriptions say order is restored, the monuments show enemies defeated, the gods receive thanks, the king stands victorious. But beyond the carved stone, the Bronze Age international system lies shattered. Egypt has defended itself against the storm, yet the storm has already changed the world through which Egypt once projected power. Trade routes are altered, former allies are gone, coastal populations shift, new peoples settle where old vassal cities once stood. The map that Egypt knew has become unstable. This is why the Egyptian evidence is so powerful and so difficult. It preserves the Sea Peoples at the moment they are turned into imperial memory. It shows fear being conquered in art, uncertainty being forced into order, but it also lets the uncertainty show through. The very grandeur of the reliefs hints at the seriousness of the threat. Empires do not carve minor nuisances into monumental battle scenes unless those nuisances have become useful symbols of something much larger. For Egypt, the Sea Peoples are defeated enemies. For history, they are signs of a world that even Egypt cannot save. The names survive like wreckage washed onto a beach sherden: Shekelesh, Peliset, Cheka, Denyen, Weshesh. They look solid at first, as if each one should point clearly to a homeland, a language, a people, and a story. But the closer they are examined, the more they behave like fragments. They appear in Egyptian inscriptions, sometimes beside Libyan groups, sometimes in the great crisis of Rameses III, sometimes as enemies, sometimes possibly as mercenaries or settlers. They are among the most famous names in the collapse of the late Bronze Age, yet they remain some of the most difficult to pin down. This uncertainty is not a failure of modern imagination. It is built into the evidence itself. Egyptian scribes rendered foreign names through Egyptian writing conventions, filtered through what they heard, what they believed, and what royal ideology required. A name carved on a temple wall is not a passport. It may preserve a real ethnic label, a regional term, a political coalition, a warrior group, or a name outsiders used more than insiders did. Scholars still debate how far these names can be connected to later places and peoples. Some connections are tempting, some are plausible. Others rest on resemblance alone, and resemblance can mislead. The Sherden are among the most intriguing. They appear before the final collapse, sometimes as enemies of Egypt and later as members of Egyptian forces. In Egyptian reliefs, they are often shown with horned helmets and round shields, a visual identity that makes them memorable. Their name has long invited comparison with Sardinia, and the island's later name makes the connection difficult to ignore. Yet difficult to ignore does not mean proven. The Sherden may have had links to the central Mediterranean, or their name may have travelled, shifted, or attached itself to people in ways the surviving record cannot fully reconstruct. What can be said is that they were recognized by Egypt as formidable fighters, skilled enough to be feared and useful enough to be employed. That double role is revealing. An empire does not always destroy the outsiders it defeats, it recruits them. Foreign warriors can become elite guards, mercenaries, garrison troops, or specialists valued precisely because their identity marks them as hard fighters from beyond the normal order. The Sherden show how porous the boundary can be between enemy and servant of the state. A group that appears in one inscription as a threat can later stand inside the military machine of the very kingdom it attacked. In a stable world, that might seem contradictory. In the Bronze Age crisis, it may have been normal. The Shekelesh are another name that has drawn attention because of possible links to Sicily. Again, the similarity is suggestive but not decisive. They appear in Egyptian records associated with attacks involving Libyans and other sea-linked groups. Some reconstructions place them in the central Mediterranean. Others remain cautious. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is easy to forget how little survives from the people themselves. No Shekelesh archive has been found explaining who they were. Their identity comes from the records of those fighting them, which means they enter history already framed as a problem. The Peliset stand on firmer ground in one important respect. They are widely associated with the Philistines, who later become one of the major peoples of the southern Levant. Egyptian texts place the Peliset among the groups defeated by Rameses III, and archaeological evidence from early Iron Age Philistine sites shows cultural features with Aegean connections, pottery styles, certain cooking practices, architecture, and even traces of diet suggest that some people with foreign traditions settled among local Canaanite populations. But here too, the picture is not simple replacement. The Philistine world that emerges is mixed, adaptive, and increasingly local over time. The Peliset may begin as newcomers, but their descendants become part of the Levant. The Jekka are less famous but equally important. They appear in Egyptian records and later seem connected with the coastal city of Dor in the Levant. Like the Peliset, they may represent one of the sea-associated groups that eventually settle along the coast after the Great Upheaval. Their story hints that the sea peoples are not merely destroyers who vanish after battle. Some become neighbours, some build communities, some enter the new Iron Age landscape not as passing raiders, but as founders of local identities that will endure in altered form. The Denian are especially debated. Their name has been linked by some scholars to the Danaans of Greek tradition, by others to regions in Anatolia or northern Syria. Such comparisons are fascinating because they seem to open doors between Egyptian records and later Greek memory. But they are also dangerous. Later myths are not straightforward historical archives, and names can echo across centuries without preserving direct descent. The Denian may have been connected to Aegean or Anatolian groups, or the resemblance may be partly accidental. What survives in the record suggests a real group known to Egypt, but not enough to draw a clean map around them. The Weshesh are perhaps the most elusive of all. They appear in Rameses III's account but leave few clear traces. Their name has inspired theories, but evidence remains thin. In a way, they are a reminder of how many ancient peoples pass through history almost without leaving a shadow. A name is carved because an empire fought them, then silence closes again. Behind that name may have been families, leaders, ships, gods, songs, and remembered homelands. But those details are gone. What makes these names so difficult is that they are not necessarily equivalent categories. One name might refer to a people, another to a region, another to a warrior band, another to a coalition recognized by outsiders, another to a displaced population whose identity was changing during migration. These sea peoples may have been a label of convenience not only for modern scholars, but in a different way for ancient states as well. Egyptian scribes had to name what they saw. But what they saw may already have been unstable. This instability can be seen in the way material culture changes after settlement. in Philistine sites. Aegean-style pottery appears, but it does not remain unchanged. It blends with local traditions and eventually develops into forms rooted in the Levant. Foodways shift. Local languages and customs influence incoming groups. Over generations, foreignness fades into new identity. This is one of the most human parts of the story. The people who terrify empires as strange invaders may, within a few generations, become villagers, farmers, traders, craftsmen, and local elites. Their children inherit not only the memory of movement, but the soil of a new home. That does not erase the violence of their arrival, it complicates it. The same group can be involved in warfare, migration, and settlement. A warrior can become a farmer, a refugee can become a conqueror, a displaced community can displace others. The ancient world rarely gives the comfort of pure categories. No single explanation fully accounts for the sea peoples, because their names probably conceal different stories moving at the same time. For ancient empires, however, such nuance mattered less than the immediate danger. The names represented forces that could not be reliably predicted. A king hearing of the Shurden or Peliset did not need a modern ethnographic definition. He needed to know whether ships were coming, whether allies had fallen, whether grain routes were safe, whether his own troops would hold. The fear attached to these names was practical before it was scholarly. It is also possible that some names became more frightening because they accumulated reputation. Once a group was known as dangerous, its name carried power. Mercenaries might trade on that reputation. Enemies might exaggerate it. States might use it to describe different outsiders who looked or fought in similar ways. Identity in the ancient world could be flexible, especially among mobile military communities. A name could become a banner, a warning, or a memory before it became an ethnicity in any strict sense. This is why the sea peoples remain so compelling. They are visible enough to haunt the record, but not visible enough to be fully captured. Their names invite maps, but resist them. Their images suggest identity, but not origin. Their settlements show transformation, but not a single path. What survives points to movement across the Mediterranean at a moment when the old order is failing. Yet the people moving through that crisis are not all moving for the same reason. To Egypt, they are enemies defeated by the pharaoh. To archaeologists, they are patterns in pottery, destruction, diet, settlement, and burial. To historians, they are fragments in inscriptions and letters. To modern imagination, they are almost spectral, sailors at the edge of a collapsing age. But they were not ghosts. They were human communities carrying names that once meant something precise to themselves, even if that precision has been lost. The empires feared those names because behind each one stood uncertainty. Not only uncertainty about where the people came from, but uncertainty about what kind of world was emerging. If the Peliset could become Philistines, if the Shurden could be enemies and mercenaries, if the Checker could raid and settle, then the old maps were no longer stable. Peoples could move, identities could harden in new lands. The sea could deliver not just armies, but futures. And for kingdoms built on old certainties, that was terrifying. The easiest version of the story is also the least satisfying. A mysterious people appear from the sea, attack the great kingdoms, burn the palaces, and bring the Bronze Age crashing down. It has the shape of a legend, sharp and memorable. It gives disaster a face. It lets the ruins speak in a single sentence. But the deeper one looks, the less the sea peoples behave like a single invading nation, and the more they resemble something messier, more human and more frightening warriors, refugees, Sailors, mercenaries, displaced families, and opportunists moving through a world where the old protections have failed. This does not make them harmless. It makes them harder to understand. In times of stability, societies prefer clean categories: soldier, farmer, pirate, trader, migrant, enemy, ally. In times of collapse, those categories begin to overlap. A farmer whose fields fail may become a migrant. A migrant may hire himself as a fighter may join a raiding fleet. A raider may settle captured land and become a farmer again. A mercenary may serve Egypt one decade and fight Egypt the next. These transformations are not contradictions. They are survival strategies in a world where the ground beneath ordinary life has shifted. That is why scholars still debate the basic nature of the sea peoples. Were they invaders? Yes, in some contexts. Were they migrants? Almost certainly, at least for some groups. Were they pirates? Some probably were. Were they refugees from drought, famine, and collapsing palace economies that is plausible for many? Were they organized coalitions led by ambitious war leaders? In certain moments, they seem to have been. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, because the evidence itself points toward multiple processes happening at once. The Egyptian scenes under Ramesses III are especially important here because they do not show only armed men. They also show carts, oxen, and what appear to be families or dependents. Royal art is stylized, and it may compress events for dramatic purposes. But the inclusion of household movement is difficult to ignore. This is not the classic image of a pirate raid, swift and temporary. It suggests people trying to relocate, carrying more than weapons. Ancient empires feared this kind of movement because it did not end when the battle ended. If the newcomers survived, they might remain. Migration under pressure is not always peaceful. Hunger and displacement can drive people into violence, especially when they encounter settled communities guarding scarce land and grain. A desperate population may seek refuge, but refuge requires space, food, and permission. If those are denied, negotiation can become force. If local states are weak, migrants can become conquerors. If armed groups escort families, the line between settlement and invasion becomes nearly impossible to draw. The Sea Peoples may have occupied precisely that blurred space. Some likely came from areas already destabilized by the collapse of Mycenaean palaces, Anatolian conflicts, or disruptions in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. When palatial centers fall, the people connected to them do not simply disappear. Craftsmen, soldiers, administrators, sailors, and dependents lose the institutions that fed and employed them. Elite warriors who once served kings may find themselves with weapons, training, and no stable patron. Ships that once carried controlled trade may become tools of escape or raiding. Communities that once depended on palace redistribution may have to move or starve. This is one reason the mercenary theory remains powerful. The Bronze Age world already employs foreign fighters. Egypt uses Sheridan troops. Other states likely hire mobile warriors as well. Military specialists can travel where pay is available. They know weapons, tactics, and the weaknesses of palace systems. If the international order breaks down, these men do not become less dangerous. They become more dangerous, because their skills are detached from the states that once controlled them. A mercenary without an employer is not merely unemployed, he is armed capital drifting through crisis. But the mercenary explanation alone is too narrow. It explains skilled fighters, not families on carts. It explains raids, not settlement patterns. It explains why some groups could defeat or threaten organized forces, but not why new cultural communities appear along the Levantine coast. For that, migration must be part of the story. The Peliset and related groups do not simply vanish after Egyptian victory. They become woven into the early Iron Age world. Their material culture appears in towns, kitchens, temples, and everyday life. That is the trace of settlement, not merely attack. Piracy also fits part of the evidence. A sea under stress creates opportunities for raiders. Coastal cities are wealthy and exposed. Trade ships carry high-value cargo. Palace authorities may be slow to respond. A fleet that knows the coast can strike quickly. Yet piracy alone cannot explain the scale of the fear recorded by Egypt or the wider transformations after the collapse. Pirates seek profit. The sea peoples, at least in some accounts, seem connected with population movement and political displacement. They are not only taking goods, they are searching for places in a changing world. There may also have been elite ambition. Collapse opens space for new leaders, a war captain who gathers ships, displaced fighters, and families can become more than a raider. He can become the founder of a new settlement or ruling group. In a world where older kings are failing, new identities can form around successful violence. What begins as a band of survivors can become a people remembered under a name. What begins as opportunism can become history. One lesser-known but important detail is that the sea peoples may not have been culturally uniform even within a single named group. Material culture does not behave like a fingerprint of ethnicity. A pot style can travel with migrants, but it can also be copied. A weapon type can be adopted. A costume shown in Egyptian art may indicate origin, but also status, military role, or artistic convention. Archaeologists therefore have to work carefully, comparing pottery, architecture, diet, burial practices, inscriptions, and settlement patterns rather than relying on one clue. The evidence remains incomplete, and every confident map should be treated with caution. This caution does not weaken the story, it makes it more real. The ancient Mediterranean was never a world of sealed containers. People had been moving across it for centuries before the collapse. Traders, captives, brides, envoys, craftsmen, sailors, and soldiers crossed cultural boundaries constantly. The sea peoples emerge from this mobile world, but under far more violent conditions. They are not strange because people had never moved before. They are strange because movement now happens at a scale and intensity that threatens the structure of empires. For Egypt and other states, the most frightening possibility is that these groups are not merely enemies from outside, but pieces of the same world returning in altered form. They may know Bronze Age weapons because they have used them. They may know palace wealth because they have served near it. They may know sea routes because they once traded along them. They may know where defences are weak because they have passed through those harbours before. The invader is not wholly foreign. He is partly a product of the very system he now helps destroy. That is a darker thought than invasion from nowhere. If the sea peoples are pure outsiders, then the solution is simple in theory: defeat them. Restore the border, return to normal. But if they are displaced fragments of the old order itself, then defeating one fleet does not solve the crisis. More people may move, more sailors may raid, more soldiers may desert, more cities may fall because the conditions producing violence remain. The enemy is not only on the sea, the enemy is hunger, breakdown, and the failure of institutions to hold people in place. Ancient empires feared this because empires depend on stillness as much as movement. They want goods to move, but people to remain classified. Grain may travel, copper may travel, tribute may travel, royal gifts may travel, but farmers should stay in fields, soldiers in armies, vassals in obedience, and foreigners in recognized roles. The sea peoples represent movement that escapes management. They are goods routes turned into war routes, labor turned into migration, military service turned into independent violence, and famine turned into geopolitical force. Their ships make this movement faster and more unpredictable, but the deeper engine is social disruption. Once communities no longer believe they can survive where they are, the map begins to loosen. Borders that seemed firm become lines crossed by hungry people. Harbours become gates. Alliances become bargaining positions. Identity itself becomes portable. This is why it may be best to imagine the sea peoples not as one thing, but as a crisis in human form. Some are predators, some are victims. Many are probably both at different moments. They burn cities and flee burning cities. They attack granaries and search for food. They serve kings and overthrow the worlds that kings depend on. They are remembered by the empires they threatened, but their own reasons are mostly lost. The real tragedy is that those reasons must have been intensely personal: a failed harvest, a lost patron, a destroyed palace, a dead ruler, a ship ready to sail, a rumour of land somewhere beyond the next coast. The historical record turns these lives into group names. But behind each name were choices made under pressure. The sea peoples were feared by empires because they arrived as armies. They remain fascinating because they may also have arrived as survivors. And survivors can be the most dangerous people in history when every safe road has closed behind them. The sea is not frightening because it is empty. It is frightening because it connects too much. For the palace kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age, the Mediterranean is a road without walls. It brings copper, tin, grain, timber, wine, oil, glass, ivory, people, news, fashion, and prestige. It allows kings to appear larger than their landscapes. A ruler inland can possess objects from islands and deserts. A coastal city can become wealthy by standing between caravan and sail. A palace can maintain its authority through materials that arrive from places its own soldiers may never see. The sea is the great multiplier of Bronze Age power. But anything that carries wealth can carry danger. Land empires understand roads, passes, forts, rivers, and borders. They may not control them perfectly, but they can imagine them as lines and points. A road can be watched, a pass can be guarded, a frontier can be fortified, a vassal can be ordered to supply troops, a rebellious city can be besieged. The sea refuses that kind of control. It has no gate that stays closed, no single road to block, no permanent border to patrol. A fleet can appear at one harbour, avoid another, land where the coast is weak, strike a supply point, then vanish beyond pursuit. This is why maritime mobility becomes a weapon in the age of the sea peoples. It does not need to destroy every city. It only needs to make every coastal city feel reachable. For a palace system, that kind of uncertainty is corrosive. Palaces depend on predictable movement. They need harvest gathered on schedule, tribute delivered on schedule, metal distributed to workshops on schedule, rations given to workers on schedule, ships arriving before inventories fail. Maritime raiding attacks predictability itself. Even rumours of unsafe seas can change behaviour. Merchants hesitate. Sailors demand protection or avoid routes. Ports hoard goods. Kings divert troops from inland concerns to coastal defence. A system built on confidence begins to spend its energy managing fear. The sea peoples, or the many groups gathered under that label, seem to understand this advantage. Their power lies not only in numbers, but in movement. Egyptian relief shows ships with high curved ends and rows of oars, vessels suited for coastal operations. Whether every detail is accurate remains debated, but the general point is clear enough: these are enemies associated with ships, landings, and sudden approach. They do not have to march slowly through imperial checkpoints. They can come from the horizon. The horizon is psychologically powerful. A dust cloud on a road gives warning. A fleet beyond the curve of the earth gives very little. By the time sails are visible, decisions must be made quickly. Is the ship friendly? Is it carrying trade goods, envoys, refugees, mercenaries, or attackers in ordinary times? A harbour knows how to sort such arrivals. In crisis, certainty collapses. A city that depends on maritime openness must suddenly treat openness as danger. This is the cruel transformation the Sea Peoples represent. They turn the infrastructure of connection into an avenue of assault. The Bronze Age maritime world is full of skilled sailors long before the crisis. Navigation is based on experience, stars, winds, currents, coastlines, and seasonal knowledge. Ships tend to follow routes where landfalls are known and supplies can be found. Islands serve as stepping stones. Cyprus is central because of copper and location. The Levantine coast is vital because it connects Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and inland trade. The Aegean is dense with islands and palace-linked ports. Whoever knows these waters can move through the political world in ways that land armies cannot easily match. One lesser-known detail is how much Bronze Age power depends on choke points that are not always obvious on a political map. A small harbour, a safe anchorage, a timber source, or a coastal storage site can matter enormously. Destroying a palace is dramatic, but disrupting the smaller nodes that feed palace economies can be just as damaging. A raiding fleet does not need to defeat an empire in open battle if it can make the empire's supply system unreliable. The Sea Peoples appear during a period when such disruption becomes especially dangerous because many states are already stretched. If a kingdom has abundant grain, loyal vassals, secure trade, and a strong navy, maritime raiding may remain manageable. But if drought has weakened harvests, if vassals are restless, if troops are deployed elsewhere, and if trade routes are already uncertain, then even limited attacks can have outsized effects. The sea becomes a force multiplier for collapse. This helps explain why coastal cities such as Ugarit are so vulnerable. Ugarit's wealth comes from its position in the network, but that position also exposes it. The city cannot move inland without ceasing to be itself. Its harbour is not optional. Its connections are not luxuries. When enemy ships threaten the coast, Ugarit's greatest advantage becomes its danger. The city is like a door that has always been open because trade requires it. And suddenly the people inside realize the lock was never strong. Land empires can try to respond by building fleets, fortifying harbours, stationing troops, or recruiting maritime specialists. Egypt seems to do this effectively under Ramesses III, at least in its own account. The defence shown at Medinet Habu suggests that Egypt counters mobility with containment, pulling enemy vessels into waters where archers and prepared forces can overwhelm them. It is a clever answer to a maritime threat: deny the raiders the open sea. Force them into a controlled killing ground, and turn their ships into crowded targets. But not every kingdom can do this. The Hittite heartland is inland. Mycenaean palaces are spread across a fractured Aegean landscape. Levantine cities depend on overlords who may be too weakened or distracted to help. Some states lack the time, geography, or administrative resilience to respond. Once multiple coastal nodes are threatened at once, Central authorities face impossible choices: defend one harbour and leave another exposed, guard the coast and weaken the interior, keep troops at home and fail imperial obligations elsewhere. The Sea Peoples exploit not only geography, but timing. They appear when the older order is least able to absorb surprise. Their attacks or movements may not have been centrally coordinated across the whole Mediterranean, but they do not need to be. In a brittle system, separate shocks can combine. A raid in one region, famine in another, rebellion in a third, and migration across a fourth can produce the effect of a single catastrophe. Later memory may compress it into one invasion, but the reality may be a cascade. The sea makes cascades faster. A collapse inland may take months or years to spread through roads and borders. Maritime disruption can leap between coasts. News travels by ship. Refugees travel by ship. Raiders travel by ship. Techniques, rumours, and opportunities travel by ship. A burned port in one region may encourage raiders elsewhere by revealing weakness. A fallen palace may release sailors and soldiers into new ventures. A successful landing may inspire imitation. The sea turns local breakdowns into regional possibilities. This is why the Sea Peoples frighten empires beyond the damage of any single battle. They represent the loss of distance. Places that once felt protected by geography suddenly feel close to danger. The water that separates also joins. A ruler cannot easily know whether a crisis in the Aegean will become a crisis in Cyprus, then Syria, then Egypt. In a connected world, the horizon is never truly far away. There is also a symbolic reversal at work. Bronze Age kings often use foreign goods to display command over distant places. Exotic materials prove reach. A palace filled with imported objects tells visitors that the ruler's influence extends across the world. But when armed foreigners arrive by the same routes, the symbolism turns against the king. The distant world is no longer contained in beautiful objects. It is standing at the gate with the weapons. That is a humiliation as much as a threat. A palace ruler claims to organize movement. He sends envoys, commands ships, receives tribute, redistributes goods, and assigns people to labor. The Sea Peoples embody movement outside his authority. They cross boundaries without permission. They arrive not as tribute bearers, but as claimants. They do not fit comfortably into diplomatic language. They are not easily addressed as brother kings or obedient vassals. Their ships announce that the world can move without the palace. For a centralized state that is dangerous in practical terms and intolerable in ideological terms, it suggests that power no longer flows only from the center outward. It can also surge from the margins inward. The real weapon of the Sea Peoples may therefore be uncertainty carried by water. Their blades and shields matter, their ships matter, their numbers matter, but their deeper power lies in making the sea unpredictable. Once the sea becomes unpredictable, every coastal economy must spend more to receive less. Every ruler must fear that allies are already too late. Every port must scan the horizon with doubt, and doubt is expensive. It consumes soldiers, grain, time, confidence, and sleep. It turns merchants into informants, sailors into suspects, refugees into possible enemies, and empty water into a threat. It forces empires to defend everywhere along a coastline that cannot be walled. It makes the old network feel haunted. So when ancient kingdoms feared the Sea Peoples, they were not only fearing warriors in strange helmets, they were fearing a new geography of danger. They were fearing the collapse of distance, the failure of borders, and the realization that the sea had always been stronger than the maps drawn by kings. The same water that built their world could now unmake it. collapse spreads inland because the sea is only the beginning. At first glance, the sea people seem to belong to coastlines, ships, harbours, beaches, estuaries, river mouths, and port cities where smoke rises close to the water. But the late Bronze Age world is not arranged in neat strips along the shore. A port is connected to a palace. A palace is connected to fields, workshops, armies, temples, vassal towns, and mountain routes. When the coast breaks, the shock travels inward. The fall of a harbour can starve a court of metal. The loss of a trade route can weaken a king's ability to reward loyalty. The burning of a coastal city can strand inland allies who depended on its ships. The sea brings the first visible terror, but the consequences move along every road. This is why the late Bronze Age collapse cannot be understood as a simple invasion story. The sea peoples are part of the disaster, and in some places they may be one of its sharpest blades, but they do not explain everything alone. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Some cities burn, others decline, some regions empty out, others transform. Some powers vanish almost completely, others survive but shrink. The collapse is not one event, but a chain reaction across a system already under strain. The Hittite Empire shows this brutally. From its capital at Hattusir in central Anatolia, the Hittite state had once projected power across a wide and difficult region. Its kings fought Egypt, controlled vassals in Syria, negotiated with Babylon and Assyria, and depended on networks that reached far beyond the Anatolian plateau. Yet by the early 12th century BC, the imperial structure is gone. Hattusir is abandoned and burned, though the exact nature of its final destruction remains debated. The city may have been evacuated or weakened before fire consumed parts of it. The old empire disappears, but Hittite culture does not vanish entirely. Successor states in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia preserve elements of its language, art, and political traditions. Collapse, here as elsewhere, is not extinction. It is the failure of a particular form of power. The Sea Peoples may have affected Hittite territories indirectly or directly, especially along the coast and in Syria. But the empire's fall also involves internal pressures, external enemies, famine, vassal instability, and the difficulty of holding a vast political network together. What survives in the record suggests a state under serious stress before its final disappearance. If the sea lanes fail, if Syrian dependencies are threatened, if grain supplies become unreliable, if rivals press from multiple directions, then even an inland capital can be pulled into a maritime crisis. Mycenaean Greece collapses in a different way. The palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, and other centres belong to a world of warrior elites, storage rooms, scribal accounting, craft production, and regional control. Their linear B-tablets show practical administration allocations of bronze, lists of personnel, livestock, wheels, armour, offerings, and land obligations. Then the palatial system breaks. Many centres are destroyed or abandoned. Writing disappears in Greece for centuries. Population patterns shift. Some settlements shrink. Others move to more defensible locations. The later Greeks remember a heroic age, but the administrative reality of the palaces is lost. Whether the Sea Peoples directly destroy Mycenaean centres remains uncertain. There is no simple evidence of one great foreign invasion sweeping through Greece. Earthquakes, internal conflict, social unrest, warfare among Mycenaean states, economic stress, and wider trade disruption may all play roles. but the Aegean is deeply tied to the maritime world in which the sea peoples appear. If Mycenaean palaces lose access to exchange, if elite warriors lose patrons, if ships and crews turn from palace service to independent movement, then Greece may become not only a victim of collapse, but one of the regions producing displaced groups. This is where the story folds back on itself. The sea peoples may help spread collapse inland, but inland collapse may also help produce sea peoples. In the Levant, the pattern is even more intricate. Some cities are destroyed around the transition to the Iron Age, while others survive, adapt, or are resettled. Ugarit falls and does not recover its Bronze Age position. Canaanite cities face upheaval, but local traditions continue. New groups appear along the coast, including the Philistines, whose early material culture carries Aegean-linked features before blending into the local environment. Inland highland settlement expands in ways that later become important for Israelite origins, though that process is complex and not simply caused by the sea peoples. Across the region, the old Egyptian imperial system in Canaan weakens, opening space for new political identities. This is one of the great consequences of the collapse. It creates room. Terrible room, but room nonetheless. When great empires withdraw or fail, smaller communities can grow. New kingdoms emerge. Local cultures become more visible. The early Iron Age is poorer in some ways than the late Bronze Age palace world, with less long-distance luxury exchange and fewer grand international archives. But it is also politically creative. Out of the wreckage come new peoples, new scripts, new religious landscapes and new forms of power. The sea peoples are feared because they stand at the doorway between these ages. Behind them lies the Bronze Age world of palace diplomacy. Ahead lies the Iron Age world of smaller kingdoms, new ethnic identities, and changed trade patterns. They are not responsible for every transformation, but they appear at the hinge. One surprising detail is that some regions show signs not simply of destruction, but of adaptation to a less centralized world. After palace systems fall, communities often rely more on local production, smaller-scale exchange, and decentralized settlement. This may look like decline from the viewpoint of palace archives, because there are fewer written records and fewer monumental buildings. But for some ordinary people, the end of palace control may not have meant only catastrophe. It may also have meant escape from burdensome taxation, forced labour, or elite extraction. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be wrong to romanticize collapse. But it is important to remember that the fall of a palace is not always the same as the end of human life around it. Still, the human cost must have been immense. Trade breakdown means scarcity. Destroyed cities mean refugees. Political fragmentation means insecurity. Skills tied to palace workshops may lose support. Scribes trained for bureaucracies may have nowhere to write. Farmers may face raiding without protection. Coastal populations may flee inland. Inland populations may find newcomers pressing into already strained landscapes. Hunger travels faster than armies when systems fail. This is the broader world in which the sea peoples become terrifying. They are not merely another enemy on a frontier. They are part of a cascade that turns local vulnerability into regional transformation. A palace burns in Greece, and warriors move. A drought strikes Anatolia, and grain routes become urgent. A port falls in Syria, and trade networks snap. Egypt defends the delta, but loses influence beyond it. Each event has its own causes, yet together they form a pattern of breakdown. Ancient people may not have seen the whole pattern. A scribe in Ugarit sees enemy ships. A farmer in Canaan sees a burned town. A Hittite official sees vassals failing. An Egyptian soldier sees foreign vessels in the delta. A Mycenaean worker sees the palace stores destroyed. Only later can these fragments be gathered into the idea of a general collapse. At the time, it must have felt like a series of emergencies, each one immediate, each one frightening, each one perhaps survivable until too many arrive together. That is how civilizations often discover their fragility, not through one fatal blow, but through the accumulation of problems their institutions were not designed to solve at the same time. The Bronze Age palace system could handle war, it could handle drought, it could handle trade disruption, it could handle migration, it could handle rebellion. What it could not handle was all of them feeding one another across a connected world. The Sea Peoples become the most memorable face of this process because they move visibly through it. They have names, they have ships, they're carved on Egyptian walls, they can be imagined in battle. Climate stress has no helmet, trade disruption carries no shield. Administrative breakdown leaves no dramatic enemy body beneath a pharaoh's chariot. But the Sea Peoples can be pictured, and so they become the symbol of a crisis larger than themselves. This does not diminish their importance. Symbols become powerful because they gather real fears. The ancient empires feared them because wherever they appeared, they seemed to announce that the old order was failing. A fleet offshore meant more than a battle. It meant the sea lanes were unsafe, allies were uncertain, displaced peoples were moving, and the world beyond the horizon could no longer be trusted to stay in place. By the time collapse spreads inland, the terror has changed form. It is no longer only the fear of ships, it is the fear of silence after the ships have gone. No more letters from a familiar court, no more copper arriving on schedule, no more palace rations, no more imperial protection, no more guarantee that the next generation will live inside the same political world as the last. The Sea Peoples did not single-handedly end the Bronze Age, but they helped reveal that the Bronze Age could end. The ruins do not speak in complete sentences. They speak in ash, cracked mud brick, collapsed walls, broken storage jars, abandoned hearths, and floors sealed beneath sudden fire. Archaeologists call them destruction layers, but the phrase can sound too clean. A destruction layer is not just a line in a trench. It is the remains of a day or season when ordinary life could not continue. It is the place where a meal is interrupted, where an account tablet never reaches the archive shelf, where a doorway falls inward, where grain burns in storage, where people leave quickly or do not leave at all. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the end of the Late Bronze Age leaves many such traces. They do not all date to the same year. They do not all have the same cause. Some may result from warfare, others from internal revolt, earthquake, accidental fire, abandonment, or later disturbance. The evidence remains incomplete, and every site has to be judged on its own terms, yet the wider pattern is unmistakable. Around the transition into the 12th century BC, many major centres are destroyed. Weakened or transformed, the old palace world loses its visible architecture of control. At Mycenaean Pylos, the palace burns, and the fire bakes Linear B tablets that were never meant to last. These tablets preserve the administrative concerns of the final period allocations, personnel, materials, military preparations, offerings. Some scholars have seen signs of heightened concern for coastal defence, though interpretations remain debated. What is certain is that the palace system does not recover. The scribal bureaucracy vanishes. The great centre that once gathered and redistributed goods becomes a ruin. The fire that destroys it also preserves the last paperwork of a state that had no time to explain itself. Mycenae and Tiryns also show destruction and rebuilding phases, revealing that collapse is uneven rather than absolute. People continue living in some places after palatial authority fails. Walls still stand, communities adapt. But the old centralized system, with its palace archives and redistributive control, is gone. This distinction matters. The end of a palace is not the end of a people. It is the end of a particular arrangement of power, wealth, writing, and command. In Anatolia, Hattusa offers another kind of silence. The Hittite capital, once the center of an empire, is abandoned and burned around the collapse period. Yet evidence suggests that parts of the city may have been evacuated before final destruction. This complicates any simple invasion scene. The fall of Hattusa may reflect planned withdrawal, political breakdown, food shortage, enemy threat, or a combination of pressures. Archaeology gives the result more clearly than the process. The empire disappears, but the stones do not say exactly who lit the last fires. Along the Levantine coast, destruction layers appear at places caught between inland and maritime worlds. Ugarit's fall remains one of the clearest and most haunting because its archives end abruptly. Other cities show damage, survival, or reoccupation. In southern Canaan, sites associated with later Philistine settlement reveal a new cultural mixture emerging from the ruins of the Late Bronze Age. The archaeology does not show a blank emptiness after catastrophe. It shows change. New pottery styles, new settlement patterns, new food habits, new identities forming inside a shaken landscape. This is where the Sea Peoples become visible not only as destroyers, but as settlers, at sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and other places linked with the Philistine world. Early Iron Age remains include pottery with Aegean connections, distinctive cooking vessels, and architectural or cultural traits that suggest incoming populations interacting with local Canaanite traditions. One surprising detail comes from evidence of diet. In some early Philistine contexts, pork consumption appears more common than in many surrounding highland communities, though patterns vary by site and period. Food is not a simple ethnic label, but it is a deeply social practice. What people cook and refuse to cook can preserve memory long after language shifts. Over time, however, the foreignness becomes less sharp. Philistine material culture changes. Pottery styles localize. The newcomers, whoever exactly they were, become part of the Levantine world. This is a pattern seen throughout history. Migration may begin with disruption, but settlement produces blending. The Sea Peoples in Egyptian reliefs appear frozen as outsiders. Archaeology shows their possible descendants becoming local. Fire layers alone cannot explain this transformation. A burned city tells of destruction, a rebuilt town tells of adaptation, a new pottery style tells of contact, movement, or imitation. A changed settlement pattern tells of political and economic reorganization. Archaeologists must read all these traces together, while resisting the temptation to make every ash layer into proof of one dramatic invasion. That temptation is strong because destruction is visually persuasive. A blackened layer in a trench feels like evidence with a raised voice. It seems to demand a violent story. But ancient cities burn for many reasons: mud brick, timber beams, stored oil, textiles, and dry reeds make fire devastating. Warfare can cause it, but so can internal conflict, accident, abandonment followed by looting, or earthquake damage later consumed by flame. Scholars still debate the causes of many late Bronze Age destructions, because archaeology often preserves the fact of burning better than the identity of the burner. This caution matters for understanding why ancient empires feared the Sea Peoples. The fear was real, but not every ruin belongs to them. they are part of a larger field of violence and breakdown. If they are blamed for everything, they become almost mythical and history becomes too simple. If they are dismissed entirely, the Egyptian records, coastal disruptions, and settlement evidence lose coherence. The strongest interpretation lies between extremes. The Sea Peoples were significant actors in a wider collapse they did not create alone. The wreck of trade is another archaeological witness. Long-distance exchange does not vanish completely after 1200 BC, but it changes dramatically. The luxurious internationalism of the late Bronze Age contracts. Palatial demand declines. Monumental diplomacy weakens. The great flow of prestige goods becomes less visible. In some regions, local production becomes more important. Iron gradually becomes more significant. Though the transition from bronze to iron is complex and not simply caused by tin shortage alone, the world becomes less glittering, less centralized, and in many places less literate. The disappearance of writing in some regions is especially striking. In Greece, Linear B vanishes with the palaces because it was tied to administration rather than broad everyday literacy. When the institutions that needed the script disappear, the script disappears too. This is a reminder that knowledge systems depend on social systems. Writing may seem like an invention too powerful to lose, but if only a narrow class uses it for palace accounting, it can vanish when that class loses its function. In the Levant, by contrast, alphabetic traditions continue and eventually flourish in new forms. The collapse of great empires may even create conditions in which smaller states and more flexible scripts become more important. The Iron Age will produce Phoenician expansion, Hebrew inscriptions, Aramaic networks, and other written cultures that shape later history profoundly. Out of the failure of one international order comes another kind of connected world. Archaeology therefore tells a story of both loss and beginning. The ruins of the late Bronze Age are tragic, but they are not the end of civilization. They are the end of a specific civilization of palaces, chariot elites, bronze diplomacy, and fragile maritime dependence. After the fires, people rebuild smaller worlds. They farm, trade, worship, fight, marry, and remember. Some remember the old age as heroic. Some forget it almost entirely. Some carry pieces of it into new identities. The Sea Peoples stand in this archaeological record like moving shadows between layers. They are difficult to isolate, but their presence is felt in the combination of destruction, migration, and coastal transformation. They are not written clearly into most ruins, but neither are they absent. Their story has to be reconstructed from Egyptian images, Ugaritic letters, burned palaces, changed pottery, abandoned archives, and settlements that look different after the smoke clears. This is why the question of fear must be answered through more than battle scenes. Ancient empires feared the Sea Peoples because the evidence of their age shows that once the old system began to break, destruction did not remain contained. Ports fell, palaces burned, archives ended, trade weakened, and new peoples appeared in old lands. The Sea Peoples were terrifying not only because they could attack a city, but because after they passed through, the world might not return to its previous shape. A fire layer is a thin thing in the earth, but sometimes it marks the boundary between ages. The records of fear are never only about what happened, they are also about what powerful people needed others to believe had happened. When Egyptian kings carved the Sea Peoples into temple walls, they are doing more than preserving military history. They are turning chaos into order. They are taking an event that must have felt unstable, frightening, and difficult to explain, and arranging it into a scene where the pharaoh stands at the center of certainty. The enemies are named, their bodies are counted, their ships are overturned, their strange helmets and shields are made visible, their movement is stopped, the gods watch. And Egypt survives. This is how empires prefer to remember danger. But beneath that controlled image lies a deeper fear. The Sea Peoples frightened ancient states not simply because they were violent, but because they exposed the limits of imperial control. They arrived in a world where kings claimed to command land, labour, tribute, armies, harvests, and gods. Yet these groups moved through spaces that did not answer easily to palace command. They came by sea, across unstable frontiers, in shifting coalitions, with identities that scribes could record but not fully understand. They represented movement beyond permission. That is why they mattered so much. A normal enemy fits into the imperial imagination. He has a city, a ruler, a border, a tribute obligation, or at least a recognizable place on the edge of the map. He may be hated, feared, or mocked, but he belongs to a known order of threats. The Sea Peoples appear at a moment when that order is dissolving. They are not merely foreign, they are uncontained. They blur the categories that empires need in order to govern enemy and mercenary, refugee and invader, pirate and settler, defeated captive and future neighbour. The fear behind the records is the fear of a world becoming illegible. In Ugarit, the fear appears in urgent messages and unfinished administration. In Egypt, it appears as monumental victory. In archaeology, it appears as burned buildings and changed settlements. Each form of evidence tells the same crisis differently. The city under threat records anxiety. The surviving empire records triumph. The ground records interruption. None gives the complete truth alone. What survives in the record suggests that the Sea Peoples became a symbol of disorder, because they arrived when disorder already had many causes. Drought had weakened harvests. Trade had become less secure. Empires had overextended themselves. Palace economies had grown brittle. Local tensions simmered beneath administrative calm. Mercenaries and sailors moved through systems that could no longer always pay or control them. When the Sea Peoples appeared, they seemed to gather these separate anxieties into human form. This is why the Egyptian texts speak with such intensity. The enemy is not presented as a minor band of raiders. They are described as a force before whom lands have failed. Even allowing for royal exaggeration, the language reflects a real awareness that something enormous has happened beyond Egypt's borders. The pharaoh's victory is framed as the defense of order itself because the crisis threatens more than territory. It threatens the idea that the world still makes sense. There is a small but revealing irony here. The Egyptian state, one of the greatest record-keeping civilizations in history, helps preserve the Sea Peoples precisely by defeating them in narrative. The defeated enemies become famous because the victor needs them to be formidable. A glorious victory requires a terrifying opponent. So the Sea Peoples are fixed in stone as the great outsiders of collapse, even though their real identities remain fluid and partly hidden. This has shaped memory for more than 3,000 years. Modern audiences still see them through the frame Egypt helped create: strange warriors, feathered crowns, horned helmets, ships in battle, a pharaoh standing firm against a human tide. The image is powerful, but it is only one angle. It shows how an empire wanted the crisis remembered, not everything the crisis was. The deeper fear is visible in what the records cannot solve. They cannot restore the old trade networks. They cannot explain every fallen city. They cannot bring back the Hittite Empire. They cannot restart the scribal offices of Mycenaean Greece. They cannot make Ugarit answer again. The records impose order on memory, but the world outside the inscription has changed permanently. Ancient empires feared the sea peoples because they revealed that imperial power was conditional. It depended on harvests, routes, loyal subordinates, paid soldiers, working ports, predictable seasons, and the belief that the centre could still hold. Remove enough of those supports, and even a great king becomes less like the master of the world and more like a man defending one shoreline against a storm he did not create. The sea peoples were frightening because they made collapse visible. Climate stress is slow and difficult to personify. Economic fragility hides inside ledgers. Social unrest begins in whispers. But ships can be seen, warriors can be carved, captives can be counted. A complex systemic crisis becomes legible when it arrives with sails and shields. That is why their memory grows so large. They gave ancient fear a face. Yet the face is incomplete. Behind the Egyptian enemy figures are communities whose own voices are mostly missing. They may have had names for themselves that are lost. They may have told stories of departure, hunger, defeat, courage, or divine guidance. They may have remembered homelands across the sea, or they may have been coalitions formed so recently that old identities were already fading. The evidence remains incomplete, and silence surrounds them more thickly than stone. For the empires, this silence was part of the terror. To rule is to classify. To classify is to reduce uncertainty. The sea peoples resisted reduction. They could be defeated in battle, but not easily explained. They could be named, but not fully known. They could be settled, recruited, or fought, yet still remain signs of a larger instability. And once that instability had entered the world, old confidence was difficult to recover. A king might still hold court, a temple might still receive offerings, a scribe might still press a reed into clay, but everyone who depended on the sea had learned something dangerous. The horizon could change meaning. It could bring wealth for centuries, and then, within a single generation, bring people desperate enough and organized enough to challenge the entire system. The sea had not betrayed the Bronze Age. It had revealed what the Bronze Age had become. Too connected to be safe, too dependent to be flexible, too proud to imagine that the margins might one day move toward the centre. This is the fear behind the records. Not that one enemy fleet might be defeated or victorious, but that the world of palaces had reached a point where enemies, migrants, and survivors could travel along its own arteries and turn its strengths against it. The same networks that once carried royal gifts now carried rumours of destruction. The same ports that once displayed prosperity now exposed vulnerability. The same foreign warriors once hired for imperial service could become part of a force no empire fully controlled. The sea peoples were feared because they were not just outside the gates. They were proof that the gates had always been open. After the fires, the shoreline does not remain empty. This is one of the most important truths hidden beneath the drama of collapse. The sea peoples are often imagined only in the moment of attack ships striking the coast, warriors clashing with Egyptian archers, cities burning in the darkness. But history does not stop at destruction. People who survive disaster have to live somewhere. They need fields, wells, houses, shrines, trade partners, marriage alliances, and names by which their children will know themselves. The aftermath of the sea peoples is therefore not only a story of endings, it is a story of new shores. Along the southern Levant, one of the clearest transformations appears in the emergence of the Philistine cities. The palimpsest of Egyptian records are widely connected with the Philistines known later from the region, though the exact path from one name to the other remains debated in detail. What matters is that after the great upheavals, coastal settlements such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza become associated with a distinctive early Iron Age culture. It contains local Canaanite roots, but also signs of foreign influence, especially from the Aegean world. Pottery styles, cooking vessels, architectural habits, and certain food practices point toward newcomers who did not simply pass through as raiders. They settled, adapted, and became part of the land. This makes the Sea Peoples more complicated than imperial propaganda allows. On Egyptian walls, they are defeated outsiders. In the archaeological record of the Levant, at least some of them become neighbours. They build towns, shape local economies, and participate in the new political world that rises from Bronze Age wreckage. Their descendants do not remain forever as invaders from the sea. Over generations, they become local people with local interests, local rivalries, and local memories. The change is visible in material culture. Early Philistine pottery shows Aegean-inspired forms and decoration, but over time those forms become increasingly local. Foreign traits do not disappear instantly, nor do they remain pure. They blend. This is how migration often works. The first generation may preserve habits brought across the water. The second generation grows up among new landscapes, new neighbours, new languages, and new pressures. By the third or fourth generation, identity may still remember arrival, but daily life has become rooted in a different soil. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how many people migrated, from where, and in what stages. A small warrior elite can influence material culture. So can larger family groups. Trade and imitation can spread styles without mass movement. But in the Philistine case, the combination of archaeological evidence strongly suggests that at least some incoming population joined and transformed existing coastal communities. It was not a simple invasion replacing one people with another. It was a process of entanglement. This entanglement becomes one of the defining features of the early Iron Age. The great palace powers no longer dominate the region as they once did. Egypt's hold over Canaan weakens. The Hittite Empire is gone. Mycenaean palatial Greece is gone. Ugarit is gone. Into the spaces left behind emerge smaller kingdoms, city-states, tribal coalitions, and regional cultures. The Philistines are one part of this new world. So are Phoenician cities farther north, Aramean kingdoms in Syria, Neo-Hittite states in Anatolia and northern Syria, and highland communities that will later be connected with ancient Israel and Judah. The Sea Peoples, then, stand near the beginning of a reshaped Eastern Mediterranean. They do not create all of it, but their movements contribute to the rearrangement. The Bronze Age had been dominated by a club of great powers writing to one another as royal equals. The Iron Age begins with a more fragmented map. Power is smaller, more local, and often more flexible. There is loss in this, but also invention. New alphabets spread, new trade networks form. Iron tools and weapons become more common over time. Coastal peoples such as the Phoenicians eventually expand maritime exchange in ways that will transform the Mediterranean again. One lesser-known irony is that the collapse of the palace world may have helped alphabetic writing flourish. Late Bronze Age palace systems often relied on complex scribal traditions controlled by specialists. When those systems fall, some scripts disappear with them, as Linear B does in Greece. But simpler alphabetic systems, already present in the Levant, prove adaptable in the changed political landscape. They can serve merchants, smaller states, and more flexible administrations. The world after the Sea Peoples is poorer in some elite luxuries, but it helps create conditions for writing traditions that will shape later civilizations profoundly. The Philistines themselves eventually become famous through later biblical traditions, often remembered as enemies of Israel, but that later image can obscure their earlier complexity. Archaeology shows them not merely as villains in someone else's story, but as a dynamic coastal culture with urban centres, craft production, trade connections, and changing identity. Their world includes temples, houses, foodways, and political ambition. They are heirs to collapse, but not trapped forever in the moment of arrival. This is important because ancient fear often freezes people at the instant they are most threatening. Egypt remembers the Peliset as enemies coming toward its borders. Later traditions remember Philistines through rivalry and conflict. Modern imagination often remembers the Sea Peoples as destroyers, but history continues past fear. The same people who appear as a menace in one archive may become farmers in another landscape, rulers of a coastal city, makers of pottery, worshippers in local temples, parents of children who no longer know the old homeland except through fragments. The aftermath also changes the meaning of the sea. During the collapse, the sea becomes a route of danger. In the Iron Age, it gradually becomes again a route of opportunity, though in new hands and under new conditions. Phoenician sailors expand across the Mediterranean. Greek communities, after centuries of transformation, eventually return to long-distance maritime expansion. Cyprus remains a crossroads. The old Bronze Age network is gone. But the Mediterranean does not stop connecting people. It never does. It only changes who controls the connection. For the surviving empires and emerging kingdoms, the memory of the Sea Peoples may have served as a warning. The coast could not be taken for granted. Populations could move. Mercenaries could become enemies. Trade wealth required defense. Greatness depended on systems more fragile than royal inscriptions admitted. These lessons did not prevent future collapses, but they entered the long memory of states that lived by the sea. The people who settled after the crisis also carried their own lessons, though their voices are mostly lost. They may have remembered hunger, defeat, victory, exile, or divine protection. They may have told stories of crossing water and finding land. They may have preserved old practices deliberately at first, as displaced communities often do, then gradually changed them as new realities demanded. The record does not let us hear those stories directly. What survives in the record suggests them through kitchens, jars, bones, walls, and the slow transformation of towns. This is the quieter side of the Sea Peoples, and perhaps the most human. Empires fear movement because movement disrupts borders. But for those who move, the story is not only disruption, it is survival. A ship that appears as terror from the shore may feel like rescue to those aboard. A new settlement that seems like occupation to one population may seem like the first safe place in years to another. History does not require choosing only one perspective. It requires holding the discomfort of both. The ancient empires feared the Sea Peoples because they brought the end of certainty. But the new shores they helped shape show that collapse is also a beginning, though never a clean or innocent one. The Bronze Age order dies in violence, hunger, and fragmentation. The Iron Age begins with survivors building amid ruins, newcomers blending with locals, and old names changing meaning in new landscapes. The sea remains between them all, bright and dangerous, carrying memory in both directions. It brings enemies, it brings refugees, it brings merchants, it brings children who will grow up speaking differently from their grandparents. It brings the end of one world and the raw material of the next. Memory does not preserve the sea peoples as they were. It preserves them as each age needs them to be. For Egypt, they are enemies defeated at the edge of order. For archaeology, they are patterns of destruction, migration, and settlement. For modern imagination, they often become something stranger, a vanished naval confederation, a lost empire of raiders, a mysterious force from beyond the known world that appears almost out of nowhere to shatter civilization. The real history is dramatic enough, but mystery has a way of attracting extra shadows. This is partly because the evidence is fragmented. Few subjects invite speculation more easily than a people known mainly from enemy inscriptions, scattered names, burned cities, and changed pottery. Where the record is silent, imagination enters. Some popular theories try to identify the sea peoples with nearly every famous displaced group of the ancient Mediterranean. Others connect them too confidently with later myths, legendary wars, or even unsupported ideas about lost civilizations. These claims can be entertaining, but most go far beyond what the evidence allows. The temptation is understandable. The sea peoples appear at one of the most cinematic moments in ancient history. Great empires tremble, palaces burn, cities vanish, ships move across a darkening sea. Then the identities of the attackers dissolve into uncertainty. It feels like a story designed to become legend, but the more grounded truth is more powerful than the fantasy. The sea peoples do not need to be Atlanteans, secret superpowers, or impossible invaders from some hidden world. They are frightening because they are believable. They are what happens when ordinary human systems fail at extraordinary scale. Later traditions may preserve faint echoes of the Bronze Age collapse, but echoes are not evidence by themselves. Greek stories of heroic wars, wandering peoples, ruined cities, and returns from overseas may reflect memories of a turbulent age, but they are shaped by centuries of oral transmission, poetry, politics, and myth-making. The Trojan War tradition, for example, belongs to a world of memory layered over history. It may preserve distant recollections of late Bronze Age conflict around Western Anatolia, but it cannot be used as a simple guidebook to the sea peoples. Scholars still debate how much historical material lies beneath such traditions. Modern nationalism has also shaped interpretations, because names like Sheridan, Shekelesh, and Danaan resemble later geographic or ethnic terms. They have often been pulled into arguments about origins and identity. Sardinia, Sicily, Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant have all entered the debate. Some connections may prove partly correct. Others may remain suggestive but uncertain. The danger comes when resemblance becomes certainty too quickly. Ancient identity is not a straight line drawn neatly from one name to one modern place. The sea peoples remind us that peoples are often made in motion. A group name may form during migration. A coalition may become an ethnicity after settlement. Outsiders may apply a name that insiders never used. A warrior label may harden into a community identity. A displaced population may absorb others along the way. The record rarely lets us watch these transformations directly, but history is full of them. Fixed maps are often drawn after movement has already happened. Popular mystery culture sometimes prefers a cleaner answer: they came from here, they destroyed that, they became this. But the evidence resists such neatness. The Peliset may be linked to the Philistines, but their origins are complex. The Sheridan may have some connection to Sardinia, but it is not settled. The Shekelesh may evoke Sicily, but the proof remains debated. The Danaan may echo later Greek or Anatolian names, but echoes are not enough. The Weshesh remain deeply obscure. Each name opens a door, and behind most doors is fog. That fog is not empty. It is where careful history lives. The best reconstruction does not strip away mystery. It disciplines it. It accepts that the sea peoples were real groups moving through real crises. It accepts that they fought, migrated, settled, and transformed. It accepts that Egyptian records preserve important information while also serving royal propaganda. It accepts that archaeology reveals cultural change without always naming the people responsible. It accepts that collapse had many causes, and that no single explanation fully accounts for the timing, scale, and unevenness of the disaster. This careful uncertainty can feel less satisfying than a dramatic answer, but it is closer to the past. Ancient history is rarely a locked room with one hidden key. More often, it is a broken room with half the walls missing, smoke stains on the ceiling, and a few labels still readable on the floor. The sea peoples have also been misunderstood because collapse itself is misunderstood. Modern audiences often imagine collapse as sudden disappearance, cities empty. People vanish, darkness falls. But the late Bronze Age collapse is both catastrophic and uneven. Some places are destroyed, others survive. Some traditions vanish, others adapt. Some people flee, others stay. Some newcomers arrive violently, others become integrated over generations. The world changes beyond recognition, but human life continues. This matters because the phrase civilization collapse can hide the experiences of ordinary people. For a palace official, collapse may mean the end of administration, status, and written record. For a farmer, it may mean danger and hunger, but also perhaps less extraction by elites. For a sailor, it may mean lost trade or new opportunities. For a displaced family, it may mean grief, movement, and the hard beginning of a new identity. There is no single human experience of collapse. The sea peoples sit at the center of these competing memories. They are villains in imperial narrative, clues in archaeological interpretation, ancestors in some later landscapes, and mysteries in modern storytelling. Each role captures something and distorts something. The challenge is to see them not as a mythic swarm, but as people living through the same catastrophe they helped intensify. This does not excuse the violence associated with them. Cities burned, communities suffered. The movement of armed groups into stressed regions could be devastating. But moral simplicity is not the same as historical clarity. People can be both dangerous and desperate. They can destroy and seek refuge. They can be remembered as invaders by those they attacked, and as survivors by their own descendants. The ancient record gives us mainly the first perspective. Archaeology hints at the second. Perhaps this is why the sea peoples remain so compelling. They refuse to stay in one category. Every attempt to define them reveals the instability of the age itself. They are not merely an external enemy, not merely refugees, not merely pirates, not merely settlers. They are all these possibilities moving together across a sea that had become too important, too open, and too dangerous. The modern myth of the sea peoples often exaggerates their mystery, but it also responds to something real. There is a genuine shock in seeing great powers fail so quickly. There is genuine unease in realizing that systems can look strong until the moment they do not. There is a genuine fascination in names that survive without stories, in ships carved on temple walls, in tablets baked by the fires that ended the offices where they were written. What should be resisted is the urge to turn uncertainty into fantasy. The unsupported theories are less interesting than the actual puzzle. The real sea peoples do not point to a lost super-civilization hiding beyond the map. They point to climate stress, hunger, migration, maritime skill, political weakness, and the fragility of interdependent systems. They show how a world can be undone by pressures that are human, environmental, economic, and military all at once. That is a deeper mystery than any fringe invention, because it is not alien to us. The sea peoples endure in memory because they stand between history and warning. They belong to the ancient Mediterranean. But they also speak to a universal fear that the system supporting daily life may be more fragile than they appear, and that the forces that break them may not arrive as one clear enemy. They may arrive as weather, shortage, debt, war, migration, rumour, and ships on the horizon. The ancient world turned them into names. Modern history tries to turn the names back into people. The work is unfinished, and perhaps it always will be. But somewhere between myth and evidence, the sea peoples remain what they have always been, a reminder that when civilizations collapse, memory often preserves the terror more clearly than the cause. The real reason ancient empires feared the sea peoples was not that they came from the sea alone. The Mediterranean had always carried strangers. It had always carried risk, pirates, merchants, soldiers, envoys, migrants, and adventurers had crossed its waters for centuries before the collapse. The sea was familiar, even when dangerous. What made the sea peoples different was the moment of their arrival and the kind of threat they seemed to embody. They appeared when the great palace world was already strained by drought, famine, war, fragile trade, shifting populations, and weakening imperial authority. They were not only attackers, they were a sign that the old system could no longer control the forces moving through it. That is why the fear was deeper than ordinary military alarm. A king can understand an enemy army. He can count chariots, summon troops, strengthen walls, send messengers to allies, and prepare for battle. But the sea peoples represented a crisis that could not be defeated by one battle alone. They stood at the intersection of many failures. They were maritime raiders and possible migrants, mercenaries and settlers, displaced communities and armed coalitions. Their ships carried violence, but also hunger, loss, ambition, and the collapse of older homes. To defeat one fleet did not end the forces that produced it. This is what made them so unsettling to empires built on order. Bronze Age kings claimed to classify the world. Lands had rulers. Rulers had titles. Vassals had obligations. Workers had rations. Metals had inventories. Grain had storage rooms. Even enemies had proper places in royal ideology. These sea peoples blurred these categories. They moved too freely. They shifted roles too easily. They could be enemies one generation and soldiers the next, outsiders in Egyptian reliefs and settled neighbours in the Levant. They reveal that the neat world described by palace records was far less stable than it appeared. The sea gave them power because it gave them reach. It allowed danger to bypass roads and borders. It allowed crisis to leap between coastlines. It allowed groups from fractured regions to appear suddenly at wealthy ports where rulers expected cargo, not collapse. But the sea was not the whole explanation. The sea was the instrument. The deeper cause was systemic fragility, a world dependent on long-distance bronze trade, centralized palaces, imported prestige, and predictable harvests had become vulnerable to cascading shock. No single explanation fully accounts for the late Bronze Age collapse. That is not weakness in the story. It is the story. Drought alone did not destroy the palaces. Invasion alone did not destroy the palaces. Earthquakes, rebellions, trade disruptions, technological shifts, and migration alone did not destroy the palaces, but together, interacting across a tightly connected world, they created a crisis that many states could not survive. The Sea Peoples were feared because they made that invisible interaction visible. They were collapsed with sails. Egypt survived them, but even Egypt could not restore the world they helped end. Ugarit did not return. Hattusa did not return as the capital of a great empire. Mycenaean palace writing vanished. The old diplomatic network of great kings fractured. The Bronze Age world of royal gifts, chariot elites, and palatial archives gave way to a rougher, smaller, more local Iron Age landscape. New peoples rose along the shores. New kingdoms formed inland. New scripts spread. The future did not stop. But it no longer followed the path the palaces expected. This is the final truth behind the fear. The Sea Peoples did not have to be the sole cause of collapse to become its most terrifying symbol. Ancient empires feared them because they arrived as proof that strength could turn brittle, that wealth could become dependence, that open trade routes could become invasion routes, and that people pushed beyond endurance could move with enough force to change history. They were not monsters from beyond the map. They were human beings from a broken world, breaking other worlds as they searched for survival, power, land, and a future. Long after the fires fade, the sea remains. It moves against the same coasts where watchmen once searched the horizon for sails. It folds over wrecks, lost anchors, broken cargoes, and harbours whose names have changed or disappeared. The palaces are gone now. Their storerooms are dust. Their scribes are silent. Their kings survive only in inscriptions, king lists, and fragments of clay hardened by disaster. But the fear that passed through those kingdoms still feels strangely recognizable. Every civilization builds habits of confidence. It trusts its roads, its ships, its harvests, its officials, its borders, its markets, its records, its gods, its maps. It begins to believe that because the system has worked before, it will keep working. The late Bronze Age world believed in connection, and for a long time connection made it magnificent. Copper moved, grain moved, gifts moved, words moved, power moved. Then people moved in ways the system could not bear. The Sea Peoples remain mysterious because history rarely preserves the inner lives of those who cross borders in catastrophe. We see them mostly through frightened rulers and ruined cities, yet behind the names were lives carried across water warriors, families, sailors, children, leaders, captives, and survivors whose own stories were not carved in victory temples. Some destroyed, some fled destruction, some settled and became part of new worlds. That is why their story lingers. It is not simply about invasion. It is about fragility. It is about what happens when hunger, movement, violence, and uncertainty travel along the same routes that once carried wealth. It is about empires discovering that the horizon is not under their command. And somewhere in that image is the final lesson of the Sea Peoples. The sea did not hate the Bronze Age. It did not choose sides. It only connected what was already breaking. It carried ships because that is what seas do. Some ships brought trade. Some brought refugees. Some brought warriors. Some brought the future in a form no palace wanted to recognize. The waves kept moving after the kings were gone. They still do.